Let me introduce none other than David Roach, who I am very delighted, even though it's only virtual on this occasion, to be here at the Lakes International Comic Art Festival. I have tried valiantly to get David to the Comic Art Festival for at least 4 years, primarily to talk to him about one of his great hobby horses. I don't want to be that mean that in a derogatory way, of girls comics, particularly British girls comics. David, hopefully, to everybody in the room, should need no introduction for his work on 2000 AD on strips such as Judge Anderson and early work such as Nemesis the Warlock. But he's probably best known now for his amazing books on Spanish comic artists, and most recently on British comic artists, a project that was published by Rebellion last year. But unfortunately, for some reason, he's not being able to publicize it. So now he can. So David, welcome this morning.
Thank you very much.
He's also sent me some wonderful slides, including the exclusive, we're going to do an exclusive reveal of the Mick Mahon Apex Art Edition at the end of this presentation, just to keep you all here, because I'm going to hold it off right to the very end. We've got an hour to trail through some of his work and some of his commissioned work, and to talk to him generally about his career. David, I suppose the most obvious question is, how did you break into comics?
Well, the page you have on the screen there was my very first solo strip for 2000 AD, which came about because I was doing a fanzine in the 80s. Through a strange circumstance of events, Steve McManus came looking for me at UCAC, which would have been 1986,
yeah,
summer of 1986. And he said to me that my stuff looked interesting. When I got out of art college, I should do a sample for him, which I did. And amazingly, even though the sample wasn't great, he gave me a job. And it really was as simple as that. So I never actually applied to 2000 AD. It was just this sort of chance meeting. And it seems that Cam Kennedy had seen my work and mentioned me to Steve McManus.
Right.
And Steve came looking for me. So such a weird way of breaking into 2000 AD.
It's great that, because I think quite a lot of us at that time, when there were physical print fanzines, came to the attention of editors. I mean, from my part, I mean, that's how I met Richard Starkings and John Tomlinson at Marvel UK, because they not only did they like the magazine I was doing, but they also contributed silly stuff to it as well. So it's great that those fanzines are now being documented by David Hathaway Price on his classic comic zines thing, because that's part of the history of British comics that, you know, I know you've touched on at times in your work.
Well, I should mention that Dave is a friend of mine, and we used to meet up in Cardiff all through the 80s. So I'd see him all the time and endlessly. It was part of a little group of sort of local comic fans. Right. So these connections go way back.
Yes, we're veterans. So you worked on Nemesis, and primarily now, I would say you're off on 2000 AD. You're probably best known for your work on Judge Anderson. How did that come about?
I got into 2000 AD at a really good time when all the good artists were going to America. So I came in to do Nemesis because Brian Talbot was doing something else. I'm not quite sure what he was drawing. And then word came out that Barry Kitson was going to work on Legion of Superheroes, which would have been Legion 87 or Legion 88, something like that. So I think I asked Steve McManus if I could draw Judge Anderson, possibly, or he asked me. It's such a long time ago, I can't remember the exact chronology of events, but basically it was somebody had to leave for their strip to come free. Barry left, I applied. I think it was because I was one of the few artists at the time who was sort of quite adept at drawing female characters, because that's not really a specialist of a lot of 2000 AD artists who tend to be more sort of into the action scenes and very sort of macho sort of male characters. So yeah, just a lucky turn of events.
Were they familiar then that you were very, you were very keen on the whole history of girls comics, and you were familiar with girls comics? Did they employ you because you did they employ you because they knew you would draw great girls? Or
well, I was one of 4 artists that came into 2000 AD in 1986. There was Simon Bisley, SMS, and John Hicklenton, all working for Pat Mills. And Pat wanted me to draw Nemesis Book 8, specifically because it was Purity's story. So he wanted somebody that was a girls artist.
Right.
So right from the very beginning, that was my my identity at 2000 AD. I was the person that could draw the girls.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So this this page we have on screen now from Engram, is that another early piece? Or
this was my second long series for Judge Anderson, and it was my favorite. I got to do all sorts of textural effects on this as if I was drawing Vampirella, which clearly has always been my dream job.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if I can't draw Vampirella, because it wasn't actually being published at the time, I will draw Judge Anderson as if it was Vampirella.
Would you say you had particular influences as an artist? Are there artists that you've sort of learned from in your career in particular?
I mean, I have published multiple books on comics, and you can assume that everybody in those books is a real influence of mine.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly, it's really a Spanish looking strip here with all sorts of textures and scratching and so on. So I was really looking at Louis Garcia, Pepe Gonzalez, particularly Jose Ortiz.
Yes,
on this one.
Of course, yeah.
And it's Jose Ortiz, of course, drew for Britain for many, many years, and was drawing in for Eagle, I think, at the same time I was doing this. I think he was drawing 13th Floor at the time, something like that. So, it sort of, it fits into the continuity of British comics while still being, a sort of a Vampirella influence.
Yeah, I don't recall, was Jose one of the artists that was doing so much work in the UK that he came and lived here at any point, or?
He only lived here for a very short time when he was drawing a newspaper strip in the 60s about a female lawyer.
Right.
It was quite short-lived. I'm a friend with his agent, and they put him up in a fantastic hotel. But he hated Britain. He particularly hated the food. He couldn't wait to go back to Spain.
And this is another this is a commission piece for Judge Anderson. So quite clearly, you've struck a chord with fans of the character.
This is a recreation of one of the pages from Engram, and I was able to fix the figure of Judge Anderson, which I didn't draw very well back in 1988. So for the commission, I corrected all my mistakes.
Do you think there's any artist that doesn't want to correct their work as soon as they posted it in the box? I'm thinking here of the glorious story of Kevin O'Neill waiting to post his artwork at the post office and then deciding he didn't like it and went back and redrew the whole thing. I don't know whether that's a true story, but I have been told it by more than one person, including Gary Leach.
I can absolutely believe that. I feel that about everything I've drawn, to the extent that I can never bear to see my stuff in print, because I can always see all the mistakes that I should have corrected before I sent the pages off.
But you learn from those mistakes, don't you? And you build on, you will approach a strip differently the next time with that, from what you've learned from what.
Hopefully, hopefully, yeah.
Because it's clear, it's in evidence from all your work, the progress of how you obviously, yes, you're influenced by all these artists, but you have your own unique style that has brought so much to not only to 2000 AD, but to the work you've done on Doctor Who, working either with Mike Collins or on your own
I mean, the idea is that each strip should be better than the previous one because we're continually learning.
Yeah.
I should mention for Judge Anderson as well. Obviously, I was very influenced by Brian Bolland.
Yeah, I'd never have noticed. Well, it's nice to see that by return he was so keen. We'll come to the cover of the book, but he very kindly did the cover of your book as well, which is a nice sort of like.
Well, yes. I mean, he's a friend of mine, and I asked him if he could do the cover, and he said he would do as long as he could draw Rupert. That's what it takes. The chance to draw Rupert.
So, like many British artists in the 80s and early 90s, you also went to work for American publishers. And so we've got a Batman issue 561 page here with various great characters, which I assume that you must have grown up reading as a kid as well.
Very much so, very much so. And this is me inking Jim Aparo.
Right.
And Jim drew some of the very first American comics I ever bought, particularly Brave and Bold. That was a big favorite of mine.
Yeah.
So the chance to ink him was fantastic. I mean, I love 2000 AD, and it's always been the biggest part of my career. But as a fanboy, I was 12 when 2000 AD came out. So there had been years of reading American comics before that and sort of fantasizing about what it would be to work over there. It almost felt like American comics were proper comics in a way, grown-up comics. I don't know. It's
which along the way you found is completely not true, because in actual fact, British comics have a much longer and richer history than American comics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, going back to the 19th century. So,
well, I think we've had many of the best artists, but it was often the writing that fell behind the quality of the art. I feel 2000 AD and Action and Battle were, they were sort of transformative in changing what British comics could be, I think. So the art was always there. The art was always fantastic.
How did you come to American comics then? Was that through your local newsagents when they were on Spinner Acts, or did you have a local person who had a little shop that they got the shipping rates?
My local newsagent stocked American Marvel comics.
Yeah.
And I just went up one day and saw these things there and thought, well, I'll give them a go. My favorite comic, I think, had just been cancelled, which was TV Action. Yeah. I loved that. You can't go wrong with John M. Burns and Jose Ortiz and Jerry Haylock every week. I mean, I was in heaven. But I think it was an issue as Jim Starlin Captain Marvel was up at the shop.
Yeah.
And it looked interesting. I took it home, didn't understand what on earth was going on. But I thought, wow, this is fantastic.
And did you, like me, like that first issue, were you able to get the next one? Because I had that with Daredevil, where I didn't actually get the next part of a story where Daredevil would have revealed his identity. I didn't find it in a comic shop for 10 years to find out exactly what happened.
I had to wait for the stories to be reprinted in, I think it was Planet of the Apes Weekly, it might have been. Yeah. So I had no idea what was going on. And it took me years to find the rest of that story. Yeah, it's always the way of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that was possibly why we had 2 Spinner Acts in our local newsagents down in St Ives in Cornwall, alongside all the British comics, obviously on the stands. But that was why my first introduction to American comics tended to veer towards DC comics, because they were one-off stories. You had those giant size super team families and the Batman collections, things like that, and a lot of those early 1970s Batman stories were one-offs at times. So there was no continuing arc until much later on.
But my world was so restricted at the time. I was only a little kid, so I could only buy what my local newsagent had. And he was Marvel, he wasn't DC. So the only DC comics I had were those I found in jumble sales.
All right.
So it was such a, these days you can go into a comic shop and there's everything.
Yeah.
But back when we were growing up in ancient times, every American comic seemed like a treasure in some way, because you didn't know when you would ever see anything like it again.
Yeah, and of course now most American Marvel and DC comics are there at a touch of a button, so you can quickly find out what happened.
That's true. And the only ones you can find on the newsstands are Panini and Titan reprints, aren't they?
Yeah, which, although they are being released at a pretty bargain rate, certainly the Panini.
Oh,
ones.
yes.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, let's moving on. Another commission. Alien, another particular favorite, or was it?
I'm really pleased with how that one came out, and it wasn't actually a commission. This was for an Alien video box set.
Oh, right.
This is back in the 90s, and it was my introduction to the world of advertising. Somehow they got hold of me and wanted several comic artists to do prints to give away with this Alien box set. I never saw the box set, so I've no idea what the rest of it looked like, though I did see Dave McKean's painting of an alien.
Wow.
That was in the advertising studio when I brought this one in, and it was still wet.
Wow.
I've never seen it in print anywhere, but my recollection is that it was absolutely astonishing. This was enormous painting of an alien head by Dave.
Well, we'll have to send your fans out to go look for it for you.
It was, they kept the original as well, I should say.
Oh, yeah. Well, I imagine if it's an advertising agency, he should have been a good rate. And we've got a tribute to Herb Trimp. Is Herb Trimp another particular favourite of yours in terms of artist influence? And
well,
Captain Britain.
What you would call classic Marvel, absolutely. But this was me inking Herb on the cover of a Captain Britain graphic novel.
Right.
It was one of 3 covers that I inked over Herb's pencils for Panini.
Yeah.
So this was maybe 15 years ago, something like that. So they were among the last things Herb drew before he died, actually. And I really enjoyed doing that. I was sort of imagining that I was Frank Giacoia or Joe Sinner back in the early 70s inking Herb, and it was just fantastic fun. That was my fanboy dream come true, that was.
And so it's interesting that so much Marvel UK art is getting more attention now. I think, you see it a lot more on heritage auction sites, for example, because people, American artists who worked on the early Marvel UK titles have been opening up their archive because they just thought, well, it's been sitting there for 50 years now, I might as well. And it is 50 years because it's 50 years of Marvel UK in 2022. So
one of the things I always wanted was a Pablo Marcos cover, because I grew up as a big Planet of the Apes fan, and Pablo drew so many.
Yeah.
But they're going for thousands now. I've missed my chance.
Yes, unfortunately. There's the only thing I remember about Planet of the Apes is the brief period where they stuck ape heads on John Carter, Warlord of Mars stories.
It was Killraven.
Yeah, Killraven, and it is massively. People think it went on for ages, but it isn't actually a very long period at all. It was just because Planet of the Apes was so popular here in the UK, and we burnt through the material just in the same way that the early Marvel titles did.
One of the first American titles that I collected was Killraven in Amazing Adventures. And I was totally confused because I thought that I'd missed the earlier adventures of Killraven. And I thought if I could find the earlier issues, there would come a point where the apes were replaced by the Martians. I couldn't figure out how he was fighting the apes in Planet of the Apes. It really confused me. I knew it was the same character. Yeah,
it's something you can track down online. There are a couple of Planet of the Apes websites that talk about this whole story of how Marvel UK, because it was Planet of the Apes was a weekly comic. It ran ahead of the Planet of the Apes monthly comic at Marvel US were putting out, and as a consequence, they decided they would continue the Planet of the Apes story by putting ape heads on a series, as Dave mentioned, called Killraven, and that was I believe at the instigation of either Neil Tennant, who of course you'll know as better as a musician, and possibly Paul Neary. I'm not sure if Paul was there at that time, or
I think it's before either of them.
Right. Okay.
So this would have been a decision in America.
Yeah.
I would have thought. Pure desperation, I'm sure. What can we make an Apes series out of?
Well, yeah, because Planet of the Apes was hugely popular here, just like Star Wars. The Star Wars Weekly sold gangbusters.
Yeah, and Master of Kung Fu.
Yeah.
I think some of the strips of some of the Master of Kung Fu strips were drawn for Avengers Weekly and then
Right.
recycled in America in giant size Master of Kung Fu and titles like that.
Wow.
I think that was the case.
I am looking forward to the long-awaited book about Marvel UK that's been in the offing for over 30 years to find out more about that kind of story.
Yeah.
Moving on. Okay, so we're now at your favorite comic character of all time. Surely
Yes.
you're not going to disguise your delight for Vampirella. What is the appeal of Vampirella, apart from the obvious, perhaps?
Well, the obvious is part of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, I started buying Vampirella comics when I was 13 or 14, and I just was blown away by the artwork, and it felt familiar to me. It confused me. I couldn't quite understand how there were names in this comic that I didn't recognize, but the style seemed so familiar. And over the years, I put it together and found out that almost all the artists were working in Britain back in the 60s and 70s. And it might have been that in a dentist's waiting room, I picked up copies of things like Princess Tina and would have flicked through them and thought, wow, this art is really nice. But of course, as a boy, you can't buy Princess Tina. I mean, it would just be humiliating. But yeah, I just got completely captivated by the artwork, particularly Pepe Gonzalez, who drew Vampirella. And I thought, this is how I want to draw. And I tried to draw, I copied panels that he'd done and tried to adopt that style as best I could. And then I just fell in love with the character, found all the back issues and just read them. Yeah, I just loved everything about it. And the chance to do my own covers for Dynamite in America was amazing.
It's a character that I will confess I'm not as familiar with, but it's one that's had a lasting influence, surely, on many other characters that have been published, not just in America, but in Europe as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Vampirella comics have been published all over the world, often in bootleg form. You find them in places like Indonesia, just the most peculiar places. Japan, there was a Japanese Vampirella comic for a while. And over here, of course, IPC published 4 issues of Vampirella in the early 70s that are quite obscure.
Well, you're sort of like capitalizing on all that interest in horror films and things like that too.
Yeah.
BBC's late night screenings of Universal Pictures films with the Hammer.
They were the most lavish comics IPC had ever published because they were on glossy paper and they were full color throughout the IPC Vampirella comics.
And of course, you also had, separately to Vampirella, you also had New English Library doing the English version of the Spanish Dracula comic as well, which...
They were very influential on how Warren comics looked in the 70s. I think that was some of the work that was brought over to America when that connection between Spain and Warren comics was established.
What were the Warren? I can't remember. Were the Warren comics widely distributed here, or was that something you came across later on?
Well, I never saw any on the newsstands, but I've got lots of copies with British stickers on, 20p stickers and that sort of thing. So they definitely came over, but not to my local newsagent, that's for sure. God, I would have exploded with pleasure to have found them at my local newsagent. No, it took decades to hunt them all down.
Yeah, managed it. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Okay, we've got another of your favorite characters. A lot of work on this one. Judge Dredd page. Tell us about this one.
Well, I spent the 90s working in America. I mean, I lived in Cardiff, but I was working for America. And then I came back to British comics. There was some connection with Stas Johnson, was meant to be drawing Doctor Who, and he couldn't do it. And then I was contacted by them. So I think it was 1999, I started working for Panini on Doctor Who. And just got more and more work from them. So didn't really bother following up American jobs. There was so much coming out of Britain. So then I went back to 2000 AD in between doing Doctor Who strips, and asked if there was anything I could do. And just pretty much every year I've done something for Rebellion, either in 2000 AD or Judge Dredd magazine, or a book or a special or something. And this was for the magazine, I think. And I got the chance to work in black and white, which is my favorite way of doing art, and I could do it in wash. And the great thing is, for 2000 AD, you can do whatever you want to. They never interfere in the style. All of us have complete freedom to work in whatever way we want to. It's absolutely fantastic that way. It's much more free than working in America. The editors tend to be more hands-on there, though I'm lucky I did have some fantastic editors. Certainly 2000, when I've done a number of Dredd strips for 2000 AD, and I think it just felt such a relief to be able to really express myself as an artist, to have that complete freedom.
It certainly shows on this page. It's absolutely stunning. So
it took forever.
Yeah. Yes. How long you touched on that in an interview last year about meeting deadlines and things like that. Is that a particular problem at times, or is it because, or do you?
It's always been a problem.
How do you discipline yourself in terms of like meeting deadlines? Do you sort of like plan out how much time you're going to spend on a strip, or ideally, in an ideal world, do you plan it out, or is it sort of like?
Maybe I shouldn't admit this, but 2000 AD don't usually give me deadlines.
Right. A bit like Commando. I mean, because obviously they get the artists to work quite far ahead. I mean,
I've been very, very lucky working with Matt Smith, the current Tharg, has just been wonderful. He's really encouraging about my work, and he gives me a script, and for the most part, there's never a deadline. I did something for Misty last year, and there was definitely a deadline for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other things, I think there's so many different strips coming in that they can just sort of schedule the various series for when the artist has finished it, or at least that's been the case with me.
But I'm getting the impression from what you said earlier that it's sometimes very hard to let pages go because you're very self-critical, but for the best of the reasons.
Yeah, I'm doing a series called Sapphire at the moment, which is written by Keck W. And some of the pages are absolutely covered with stuck-on replacement panels because I'm really, really enjoying the strip. The writing is fantastic, and I feel it's a chance to show what I can do.
Yeah.
But because there's not a pressing deadline, that means I can fiddle and finesse endlessly.
Okay, we've got another Anderson's page here. This is another favorite page.
Yeah. This was a series called Undertow. And I drew the first 4 episodes of that. I couldn't finish it. I think there were just, for some reason, there were a lot of things that came in at the same time. And this did have more of a deadline. Yeah. And unfortunately, I couldn't finish it. So Mike Collins finished it off. Mike and I have collaborated on so many things over the years. It's incredible. But this was the first page of Undertow. A really well-written strip by Emma Beebe, and I'm really pleased with that page. I think everything about it works really well. It's rare that there's a page where I like every panel. Usually there'll be 1 or 2 panels that I like and a few that I think, what was I thinking of? I'd clearly forgotten how to draw that day, but this one is okay. I can bear to look at it.
Well, take you through, and then of course, side by side with your work on 2000 AD in the magazine, you've also done quite a lot of work for Doctor Who magazine over the years. Again, you mentioned working with Mike Collins, but you have worked solo as well, haven't you? So
yes, this was the frontispiece to an annual. I think it was 2007, 2008, something like that. I'm really pleased with how that one came out, actually. David Tennant was great to draw. And it was coloured by Dylan Teague, who used to share a studio with Mike Collins and myself.
Yeah.
So we've all three of us have collaborated over the years again and again. And in fact, until the pandemic, I would see Dylan every week because we would go to life drawing together. We'd be sitting next to each other. So every day, every week for 10 years, we would be there doing life drawing together.
Which is something we'll touch on. We'll come to your life drawing.
Come to that, yes.
And so obviously you've done a lot of covers for the collections of that Panini put out. This is trying to spot every single character. The number of characters on this one in particular is.
I'm really pleased with how Sylvester McCoy came out on that one because he is hard to draw. I can tell you.
Yeah, you're not the only one to say that. Lee Sullivan and well, not Lee, but John Ridgway and Mike has said the same thing, haven't they?
Yeah. I don't know what it is about his face because he's such a distinctive actor. You would think his face would be particularly memorable, but when you actually come to draw it, it's not as sort of peculiar and quirky as you might imagine. So it's very, very difficult to capture him. Someone like Peter Capaldi is fantastic.
Yeah.
But no, Sylvester is by far the hardest. And this was the last of the Sylvester collections, I think. And I thought, I finally got him. But yeah, that book took forever.
We can believe it. Okay, and this is another, is this a commission? This
is a commission. Yeah, in the last few years, I've gone to a lot more conventions. And something that's grown up is people wanting commissions, which they ask for in advance, and you can bring them along to the conventions, and then they'll come along and pick them up from you. And I think that's the best one I've done. It just really came together. I've never read Sandman, so I don't know anything about death whatsoever. I saw a picture of her holding an umbrella, and I thought, well, I'll do that. I had no idea what to stick in the background. I thought, well, I'll put some jellyfish in there. Who knows why? There could be some story, but I don't know. It just felt like something that would be fun at the time.
The freedom of commissions, and of course,
the
same for Vampirella as well.
I've done a lot of Vampirella commissioning, and I'm really pleased with how this one came out.
And it's sort of obviously this is perhaps obviously influenced by the work you've done on your life drawing.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've used some life drawing models as models for the commissions.
Right.
Not in this case, but some of the others have been, certainly.
Is this a cover or another commission?
No, this is a commission. This was one of the later commissions that I've done. So this is only probably 2 years old. And again, it just really came together. There's no reference for this one. It's not based on a life drawing pose or anything. But yeah, I've drawn Judge Anderson and Judge Death quite a lot over the years. And that was a particular favorite one. I mean, the Judge Death book that collected the Dark Judges story, that was my main reference for Judge Anderson.
Right.
When I was drawing the strip. So I always go back to that one. I don't know if Brian will ever forgive me.
I'm sure he's. And of course, we touched on your life drawing. This is a particular example of something you've sent us of an influence or of work you admire.
I did it.
You did it?
I did it, yes.
So I apologize. I did not realize you did it. I thought it was something you'd included to sort of like say this was an inspiration for your work.
This is me. This was my friend Anthony Reynolds. This is his latest album. It came out only a couple of years ago. And it's a montage. The figure in the background, the girl, that was a large scale drawing I did. I drew Anthony on a separate piece of paper, and there's an easel behind him as well. And the three elements were put together in Photoshop. And then they were colored by the designer. It's clearly meant to look like an old pan cover. And Anthony is the model for the inspector in Sapphire in 2000 AD. So there's all these connections going on.
Right. Right, yeah. Well, you completely fooled me. I thought it was an old pan book that you included purely in this set of photographs, images you sent me, that it was an indication. But yeah, obviously, I knew full well that this was one of your works, and obviously, it's one of the most tasteful ones we can present here at a all family audience event. But but you are a very strong advocate, as are some of the people who are in the room here, including Ryan Hughes, for example, about life drawing and the value of life drawing, particularly for, you know, not just for artists, but for comic strip artists, to do something to help them hone their skills as storytellers.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And for me, it's very much part of what I enjoy about being an artist. When I was growing up, I never drew comics. I loved them and I would draw comic characters, but I was not someone that ever drew comic strips. But I would draw real people all the time. And I went to art college, and this was what I did all the time, every week. And it was only after I left art college that I ever started drawing comic strips, really. Yeah. As much as I loved them. Comics are always a compromise. You know, even for me, there's a point when you have to turn the page in, and you're mostly drawing in line, in pen and ink. Sometimes you can do tonal work, and I tend to stick them in every now and again. But it's always, you can't spend all week drawing one figure, but I can doing these.
Yeah.
So it's a chance to really push myself as an artist. I'm colorblind, so what can I do? I work in pencil rather than paint. And some of these are based on photographs of models from life drawing. Right. And they can take typically 3 or 4 days to a week. And I just love the contrast between the figure and the cloth. I always sort of combine the two elements to create a sort of interesting tonal juxtaposition.
You're not the only British comic artist to be colourblind, because by report, Keith Watson, who drew Down There, was also colourblind. Oh. So that has been one of the things that I think Richard Sheaf, who has documented a lot of the Eagle material, and other people who have followed Eagle, have always wondered, you know, whether there was a truth to that. But even Don Harley couldn't say for sure. Unfortunately, Don's no longer with us to ask. So
I believe Howard Chaykin might be as well.
Right.
I think that's the case. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not terrible, but I can't really mix paints. It was when I was in school that my art teacher made me have a test, because I was mixing paints. I was mixing everything down to a very grey look.
Right.
Which is presumably how I saw the world compared to other people. I don't know. Yeah, he gave me this test and I just completely failed. So then I thought, oh, I'm colorblind. Who knew?
But despite that, became a fantastic comic artist. You know, as others have faced these challenges in their careers, you managed to surmount that one with skill. And obviously, you've got 2 strings to your bow, because not only are you a very accomplished comic artist, but you've also written several books about the history of both American and British comics and Spanish comics, Spanish comic artists. How did you come to work in that as well? Was that something, was your Hellfire zine, was that all comics, or was it?
No, Hellfire was mostly articles and interviews. Yeah. So there would be 8 pages of strips in each issue, but no, it was mostly interviews. In fact, I was only the 2nd person ever to interview Alan Moore, as far as I know. Right. And the interview that I did in Hellfire with him is in a book called Conversations with Alan Moore. Yeah. So, yeah, it's funny. I do get a lot of people that don't realize that the person that draws comics is also the person that writes the books. I'm forever having people that don't realize that it's just me. But I've always been a collector, always been a fan. You know, I wrote for loads of fanzines like Cerebro and FA and things like this. I was even in 1 or 2 issues of Escape. So, you know, I'm officially cool, or at least I was for a few months back then.
So was The Warren Companion your first full book, or was this one of several books?
Yeah, this was the first full book. I think I was in, I'm not totally sure of the chronology, but I certainly did a few things with Frank Plowright.
Yeah.
On their sort of comics to read. I can't remember what it was called now, but there were a few of us that were reviewing comics for some of Frank's projects. But yeah, I think I wrote to John Cook in America when Comic Book Artist came out. I thought this was a fantastic magazine, and could I write for him? So I wrote a few things for him, including an article about Warren for number 4 of Comic Book Artist. And then he said, we're going to expand this to a full book. I thought, this is fantastic. So we very much did it together. He did all the interviews. I wrote all the sort of historical text and did a massive checklist. And other things followed from then. So if you count comics that books that I've written and contributed to, it's over 30 now.
Yeah, I'm going to flick through a couple because we obviously want to let people ask questions from the audience, but obviously
sure.
Your love of war comics obviously apparent in it's war, but it's the Spanish comic artists, and I'll just jump to both those covers, because this is the work that I first came across. Although I have a copy of War and Companion, these are the ones that I stick in my mind as being the ones where you set your benchmark for how much work and how much research you did. And not only did you're not only researching about the history of the comics as published, but obviously you're working to try and find out material from Spanish comic artists, some of whom won't necessarily speak English, or the documentation may not be in English. Do you speak Spanish as well, or
Not a word of it? No. No, thankfully, you have Google Translate now. So there's quite a few artists that I've written to and just had to translate what they're saying back to me. But really, it's just because, I mean, about 30 years ago, I started doing comic lists with Steve Holland.
Yeah.
So that's the basis for so many of these, is because I have read and seen almost every British comic published. So that formed such a basis of knowledge of what these artists were doing in their early days. And I'm just an inveterate collector.
Born of your frustration of not knowing who'd drawn the Princess Tina that you picked up in the dentist or wherever.
I can't stand the thought that there is an artist out there that is really great, and I didn't know who they were. It seemed wrong in some way. I took it as a personal affront. And really, that's behind so many of these books. It really is.
Which is why it's quite nice that you actually do have a unknown artist in Masters of British Comic Art, which sort of like reflects, somebody you did try and track down without success, but there is one in there, despite the huge range that are in this fantastic book, that it's like a tribute. It's like the unknown artist.
The unknown artist. Yeah, I mean, I think between Steve and myself, we have identified at least 90% of the artists that worked in British comics, or at least if you ignore the funny side, because that's not really my area, that's much more Lou Stringer's speciality. But yeah.
It's not easy though, is it? Because I mean, the only way you'd have access to it is through like the pay books, for example, which you have seen some of, but they don't all exist. They've been lost down the years. You hear about, for example, when the Daily Mirror purchased the Daily Express, it acquired the Daily Express archive of artwork, which includes TV21 and Countdown. And when I spoke to the head of their archive, they said, oh yeah, the first thing, we had to get rid of all the paperwork, of course, for data protection. So, you've lost all that. It's the first thing that went out the window. So Fleetway's paying in books credit who they paid. But as far as the artists were concerned, it was almost always just agencies anyway. So all you will see is Bardon or Temple. Yeah, Bardon or Rogers or Temple or Grestock and March. So, it's just literally 30 years of research, of endlessly looking, finding references in other things, like, women's magazines may have a credit, or an old annual may have a credit, and you just try and match the styles and imagine how they evolved over the years. And of course, published, from my own experience of doing Down the Tubes, but with Steve Holland's Bear Alley, which he was doing he started his about 2006, something like that, and Lou Stringer's blog, which is now sadly sort of like a moment in time as far as Lou's concerned. But people, people whose family are looking for their father's work or their mother's work suddenly pipe up in the comments, oh yes, I've got some in the attic, or thank you very much for this article, and they'll send you more information. Recently, I did a piece on Ken Horton, who trained Sean Phillips, for example, or was part of Sean's learning process as an artist, and his son has been in contact with me, so I've got more information. And now I know you've got a checklist of all Ken Horton's work as well. I shall come back to you about that.
We did something not so long ago about Bill Titcombe, didn't we?
Yeah.
I think it's really important to celebrate these artists' work. If it's someone like Ken or Bill that most fans don't really know, though they will definitely know their styles, they would have grown up reading their work without really considering who they were and how much they'd done.
Well, sadly, the articles that we put together about Bill Titcombe were born of the fact that I was aware that he had told Des Skin that he was not very well, and was worried that people wouldn't remember him. So I said, right, we'll make darn sure that
we'll do it, make sure, yeah. And the more you look at these people's work, you realize just how talented they are. That's the thing.
You mentioned, you're not the humor comic artist, but the amount of work that Bill Titcombe, from the Telegoons, Tom and Jerry, Basil Brush, huge amounts of stuff, TV comic.
Yeah, astonishing. Very versatile as well.
Right, I'm just going to show these two covers that you're working on, the Brian Bolland book.
Okay.
And we're going to give people, I'll leave it with the reveal of the Mick Mahone 8th edition, which some people will recognize the cover. But I will now give 15 minutes over to people to ask questions, or I will ask more obscure ones. So let's have some questions in the audience for David. At the back first.
Characters that you've not drawn yet that you like to?
Are there any characters yet that you have not drawn yet that you would really like to?
I would love to do Modesty Blaze in some way.
Wow, yeah.
I think that was one of the, I would regard Jim Holdaway as one of the sort of 3 or 4 greatest British artists. And Modesty was, I mentioned earlier that British comics weren't well written. Modesty Blaze was definitely an exception. Mm-hmm. That was really, really well written. Peter O'Donnell was a fantastic writer. So yeah, Modesty Blaze is something I'd always love. But if you're looking at more recent comics, the strip I would love to revive for 2000 AD, if it ever came about, would be Mind Wars, which ran in Star-Lord. I don't know if you remember that one. Yeah. It was drawn by Jesus Redondo, who was a big hero of mine. I've got some of the original art for the strip as well, and it's always been a favorite of mine. And I always regret the fact that it just ended when Star-Lord ended. They literally flew off into space. So many strips carried over into 2000 AD, like, Robusters and Strontium Dog, but not Mind Wars. It's so frustrating. So that would be my strip.
It's quite clear from talking to Alan Hebden that I think he would love to write more of it if he had the opportunity. So maybe you should try again. And of course they've reprinted it, but not in a proper collection as yet. But we can hope.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yeah. There you go. I'm putting it out there for Tharg if he's listening. Mind Wars. This is what we need.
As you said, you mentioned the fact that you've got some artwork from the series. One of the things that when I was doing the Charlie's Wars book for Titan Books, while working with Pat, as we built up a relationship, Pat suddenly volunteered the information that Joe Colquhoun's daughter had a lot of Joe's work, because Pat had made sure that all the artwork that was in it that had survived went back to Joe. And as a result, the quality of the later Titan books improves because we were able to utilize that. And we went, Moose Harris, who is, he is the person who's in the band. He was in the Damned as well. Went down to Jane and went through the whole archive of the artwork, and so we were able to do much better collections. And that's been your pursuit for the last 2 years, really, hasn't it, to find original art by Brian Bolland and by Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's these books sort of started in America, the artist edition concept, and it is basically the chance to collect the best work by our best artists. and have it printed the actual size.
Mm.
So these books are going to be absolutely colossal when they come out, because Mick and Brian worked at a very, very big size, particularly in the early days of 2000 AD. But of course, modern reproduction techniques are way in advance of what they had back in the early 70s. And 2000 AD was printed on terrible paper.
Yeah.
So there's the subtlety of the art has never really been captured in print, but now it can be, to the extent that you can see little paste ups and corrections and whiteouts and so on, and where the word balloons have gone yellow or in some cases fallen off. So it's, I like to think of them as, it's not like a sort of an art book so much as almost like going to an art gallery. That's what it's like, the chance to really see the originals as
they're going to be a large book, are they? Is that
they're going to be colossal, yeah.
So they're like the IDW.
Yeah.
Wow.
They are.
Fantastic. Joel, you had a question.
I was going to ask, you've always been a voracious collector of other people's original art. Does it still feed into your own work?
As a voracious collector of other people's art, does that art then feed into your own work?
In my dreams. Yeah, I mean, there's certain artists whose work I have on my drawing board as a sort of constant inspiration, particularly Jesus Blasco, because I've got a lot of his originals, and they just look unbelievable. His draftsmanship and his inking style was just, I mean, he was one of the absolute greats. So if you think back to his work on the Steel Claw, it's just about, you know, some of the best looking work of the 60s. I've also got some amazing Ron Embleton originals. They are very inspiring, but unbelievably difficult to reach that sort of standard. Because again, I was talking about Jim Holdaway. I would have Ron Embleton up there with him and Frank Bellamy as sort of these giants of British comics. It's a constant source of inspiration. I look at original artwork every day.
Yeah, there's others, of course, down the years. You know, Mike Noble, Ted Kieran. Ted Kieran always, to me, always seems rather overlooked because there's the impression that he only ever drew Robot Archie. But some of the work, if you actually look at the boards that he did, to me, I just love them. Some of the faces on those pages. But you can see that in the original art, and hopefully we'll be able to see that kind of level of work in these Apex editions that are.
Oh, they're going. Believe me, I've got the 2 books on my computer, so I know what the standard of the art is like, and it's going to blow minds. It really is, because for both of them, we've got a lot of their very best strips.
Yeah.
With Mick's book, we were very, very lucky because Kevin O'Neill found some of Mick's slain title pages from Sky Chariots, mixed in to a pile of his work that had been returned to him by 2000 AD years ago, and he'd never looked. Can you imagine? You're looking through a pile of your own work and you find some Sky Chariots originals in the middle of them. You know, it's just astonishing. So we've got many of the absolute best Sky Chariots pages, which for many people, I think is the best thing ever published in 2000 AD.
Well, there are stories, of course, of artists being sent a wodge of their artwork back by IPC Folk Fleetway, and there's artwork by other people in it. I mean, I know John Cooper, for example, his wife sold a lot of work to Rufus Dayglow without realizing that some of the couple of pages were a totally different artist. They just got mixed up because whoever sent that wodge out, and I know at Marvel, when we sent all the artwork back to artists at one point, because Paul Neary wanted the room for the Marvel UK equivalent of the Marvel bullpen. There were piles of work by Mario Capaldi, who wasn't very best pleased when we sent back a pile that high. Or to see, I phoned him up about an event. I've mentioned this before in stories, but I phoned him about something completely separate years later. And he said, "You're the bugger who sent my artwork back, aren't you?" Because he had my name was because he's all in a blooming garage and I can't get my car properly into it. But fortunately, his daughter is so in awe of him that she's actually arranged exhibitions of his Transformers work and that sort of thing. So finding this artwork is great because not only is it going to go in these books, but hopefully there's always the opportunity. Now Rebellion have their own archive of art, and they're going to open it up to academics and to the members of I'm not sure about members of the public, but certainly that is their plan with a new Oxford they're out of Oxford, huge movie base that they're going to have. There is a plan to enable people to see this, to research this as well, isn't there?
It is unfortunate that, I mean, yes, it is fantastic, the idea that there are these archives of artwork out there. But of course, one of the sad facts about British comics is so much of it was destroyed.
Yeah.
I mean,
Shirley Bellwood, who you mentioned earlier, in particular.
yeah, I mean, I sorted out IPC's warehouse for them. So I've seen every page that survived and I've catalogued it. And there was not a single page of Misty, for instance, since we're talking about Mario Capaldi, who was one of the key Misty artists.
Yeah.
I have one page which I bought from somewhere else, a Shirley Bellwood splash page. And the only reason it survived was because it was used in-house as a cutting board. So it's got cuts all the way through it from a scalpel.
Yeah.
But yeah, not a single published page of Misty survived. It was all destroyed back in 1984, I think.
But although obviously, you know, artists were offered the opportunity to have their artwork back on occasion here, they were told they could have it back at a price. But Shirley Bellwood herself didn't hold much truck with her comic art. She didn't value it in the same way that you or many other comic artists would. I mean, I going back to random encounters, thanks to articles on websites, her next door neighbor contacted me and had a piece of Shirley's work and a few other bits and bobs. And she just said, oh, it's just comics. I'm not really, you know, it's just something I just did. And she was more proud of the work she did for books. To her, from what he said, that was proper art as far as she was concerned, and didn't regard comics in the same way.
And yet, it's the comic strips that survive in people's memories. These are the things that will survive over the years. And the only reason that her name will live on is because of her work in comics, not because of illustrations or portraits that she did. Yeah, because they're not, again, she may not have been credited for those book covers at that, you know, back in those times. Let's have another question from the audience. I'm sure there must be some. Can't even encourage Paul Gravett to ask a question, I'm sure. Paul knows everything about me. Yes, that's a very good question. Who's coming after Brian Bolland and Mick McMahon? Have you been doing other material? And will you be doing other non-2000 AD books, for example, Charlie's War, given that we know how much of Joe's work is held? There's a thought. Certainly, from my point of view, I would love there to be more of these books. Nothing has been said to me, particularly. I think we're going to wait and see how they sell. Yeah, because they are quite expensive things to put together. Obviously, you know, we started off with the two biggest names, the two biggest draws, but clearly we could have amazing volumes of Dave Gibbons, Kevin O'Neill, Carlos. Carlos might be the obvious choice for the next book. I don't know, but I do have something coming up next, which I'm also working on. I've been working on Brian's book, Mick's book, Drawing Sapphire, and writing another book all at the same time. And this is going to be called Valentine's. And it's a collection of the best British romance strips. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, so that's going to be over 200 pages long. Wow. From the 50s to the 70s. It's going to have a certain amount of text in it as well. But I've gone through my collection of British romance strips. And this is from things like Valentine, Mirabelle, Roxy, Marilyn, Serenade, up to Pink and Oh Boy. And people might think, well, they don't want a collection of romance comic art, but the art is amazing. And it will be all the great Warren artists like Pepe Gonzalez and Jose Ortiz and Esteban Maroto, along with British artists like Mike Hubbard. But there's also John M. Burns, Jesus Redondo, Ian Gibson, people like this. So hopefully it's going to really open a lot of eyes. Is that for publication next year, or is it still? That's going to be Valentine's Day 2023.
Well, that
We're
is,
working well in advance.
well, that is something definitely wonderful to look forward to, David. And thank you very much for a enjoyable trek, not only through your comic art, but briefly touching on the huge amount of British comic history. I should add, if you are on Facebook, you are capable of following a particular person, then David is on Facebook, and he regularly presents both American and British art to people who follow him, just because just to celebrate the form. So do track him down, not in any spooky sense or scary sense.
No stalkers.
No stalkers, no stalkers. But David, thank you very much. I'll give you a round of applause. And
Thank you.
And hopefully at some point we will get him here. We will get him here in this room, and we will get more than just David. We'll try and get more people who we talk about who are involved with British Girls Comics, which is another big hope of mine. I should say thank you very much to 2000 AD for, in part, facilitating this event by allowing us to present this cover, which is an exclusive. So get your cameras out and take it out. And thank you very much. Cheers, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much.